August 13th, 2011, Fairfield, Ohio. A warm, still night, in a second-floor apartment, a young art student packed for a new life. Her sketchbooks stacked neatly, her suitcase half-zipped, a plane ticket to Colorado resting under a glass paperweight. Sometime after midnight, the lights went out. When the sun rose, her car was still in the driveway, her phone still charging by the bed, and her balcony door slightly open, but Lila Dawson was nowhere to be found. Police found no struggle, no forced entry, only silence. Neighbors who once waved across the street now searched the woods with flashlights, whispering her name. And as the years passed, her story became one of Fairfield's deepest scars. What really happened inside that quiet apartment? Where are you watching from? And do you remember a night like that in your town? Subscribe and turn on the bell, because every cold case begins the same way, with someone who never came home. Fairfield, Ohio, August 13th, 2011. The kind of summer night that seemed almost staged, where the stillness clung to everything, and the warm air pressed gently against the old houses along Pleasant Run Road. In a cramped, second-floor apartment, the soft glow of a desk lamp spilled out onto the cracked sidewalk below, a beacon in the quiet dark. Inside, Lila Dawson sat hunched over her cluttered workspace, her hands stained with streaks of charcoal and acrylic, her mind lost in the intricate lines of her final art project. At 21, Lila was the embodiment of quiet ambition, all thoughtful eyes, gentle smiles, and a restless creativity that spilled out of her sketchbooks and onto the walls. She wore her favorite threadbare hoodie, sleeves rolled up despite the warmth, and the air was tinged with the fresh, sharp scent of mint tea cooling beside her. Tonight was supposed to be the turning point. On the corner of her desk, a one-way plane ticket to Colorado gleamed under a paperweight, weighed down not just by glass, but by the heavy promise of a new life she'd mapped out with meticulous care. In less than a week, she would leave this apartment, leave behind the safety of routine and the weight of small-town expectations, and start over with Evan, her fiancé, her best friend since high school. Together, they'd picked out a tiny rental in Denver, sent out applications, even argued about the color of their future couch. But that night, as midnight drew closer and the shadows pressed against the windows, Lila worked in silence. She barely noticed the world outside. The hum of cicadas drifted through the cracked open balcony door, mixing with the faint sound of distant traffic. Her phone buzzed with a message from Evan, a small argument lingering at the edges of her thoughts, the kind of disagreement that felt big in the moment, but trivial by morning. She sighed, rubbing her temples, reminding herself that everything would be okay. She texted back, "I think everything's going to be okay," letting the words hang there like a whispered hope, even as uncertainty gnawed at her. She didn't know this would be her last message. At 11:45 p.m., she closed her laptop, pushed her project aside, and leaned back, letting her eyes drift around the room one more time. The space was filled with the evidence of her life. Messy piles of art supplies, a battered bookshelf crowded with thrift store finds, photos of friends taped to the refrigerator. Her father's old watch sat on the nightstand, ticking steadily. A quiet reminder that Sunday was coming, and with it his usual visit, his apple pie, his gentle warning not to stay up too late. Outside, the world held its breath. In the neighboring apartments, lights flickered out, one by one. A dog barked at a passing car. Somewhere far off, a train rattled across the tracks. Fairfield was a place where people still waved at neighbors and trusted the silence, a town that never imagined it could harbor anything darker than a summer storm. And yet, as the night deepened, a subtle unease seemed to creep into the apartment. Lila's tea grew cold, untouched. She glanced once toward the open balcony door, drawn by the hint of a breeze, the curtains shifting just so. She felt a prickle along her arms, the kind that made her pause, listen, tell herself it was nothing. The hours slipped past. The lamp cast long, strange shadows. By midnight, the only sign of life was the soft blue glow of her phone, still resting on the edge of the bed, and the faint warmth of the blanket she'd pulled around her legs. By morning, her phone would never ring again. The apartment would sit in perfect, eerie order, purse, keys, and phone neatly arranged, as if she had simply stepped out for a moment. But Lila was gone. Only the silence remained. What really happened that night? The answer would haunt Fairfield long after the last light in Lila's window flickered out. In the heart of Fairfield, Ohio, where the trees arch over the streets and the houses cluster together like old friends, life moved at a gentle, predictable pace. This was a town that thrived on routine, where the hum of lawnmowers on Saturday mornings blended with the smell of fresh coffee and newsprint. Children played in front yards until dusk. Parents gathered on porches to trade stories, and the biggest headlines were usually about the high school football team. Within this peaceful bubble, Lila Dawson stood out in quiet ways. At 21, she was known for her creativity, for the soft way she listened to people, for her laughter that broke through even the dullest of days at the local cafe. She had grown up in Fairfield, learned to ride her bike on its cracked sidewalks, and knew every twist of its winding roads. Her hair, always a little tousled, caught the sun when she walked to work. Her hands were rarely without smudges of ink or flecks of paint. She lived alone now, in a tiny upstairs apartment on Pleasant Run Road, a space that overflowed with art and life, even though its square footage barely allowed it. Her neighbors often saw her at odd hours, hauling grocery bags up the stairs, pausing to pet a stray cat, stopping to chat with Mrs. Wilkins from across the hall. Lila had a gentle presence, the kind that made people want to confide in her, and even those who didn't know her well felt a vague comfort knowing she was around. In a town where not much changed, she was one of the few who dreamed of leaving, but she never made a show of it. Her plans, like her art, were precise and private. Across town, her father, Dave Dawson, kept to his own rituals. He was a retired carpenter, sturdy and weathered from years of honest work, his hands strong but tender. Every Sunday, he visited Lila, carrying a homemade apple pie and a half-joking warning not to stay up too late. He'd linger at her kitchen table, sipping coffee and scanning her half-finished paintings, sometimes asking about colors or shapes, always careful not to pry too much into her future. His love was quiet but unwavering, a steady anchor in the shifting tides of her life. And then there was Evan McKinley. At 23, he managed the local print shop, his days measured by the rhythm of paper and ink. He and Lila had grown up side by side, their childhoods stitched together by school dances, long bike rides, and awkward confessions under the bleachers. Their engagement, announced with shy smiles and nervous laughter, seemed like the natural continuation of their story. They made plans to leave, to start over, to find a place where Lila's dreams could stretch as far as the horizon. But under the surface, small fissures had started to form. Arguments about the move, about money, about Lila's restless ambition versus Evan's need for certainty. The tension was never loud, never violent, but it hovered in the corners of their conversations, in the silences that followed their goodbyes. That weekend, as the sun dipped below the Ohio hills, the light in Lila's apartment stayed on long past midnight. No one in the complex thought much of it. Students and young couples often kept strange hours. Downstairs, someone's television played late-night reruns. In the parking lot, a pair of headlights swept briefly across Lila's window before vanishing into the dark. No one realized. Not the neighbors. Not the man who walked his dog past her building. Not the mail carrier who delivered her last letter. That this would be the final night her light burned. The details that would later seem so significant, the unlocked door, the cup of cold tea, the half-finished painting, all went unnoticed. In Fairfield, a town built on trust and repetition, the idea that someone could simply vanish was unthinkable. But in the quiet hours before dawn, something changed. The fragile peace of Pleasant Run Road was broken, not by noise or struggle, but by a silence so profound that it would echo through the lives of everyone who knew Lila Dawson. Sunday morning dawned with golden light spilling across Fairfield's sleepy streets. The day began as every other, with the sound of birds in the sycamore trees, neighbors fetching newspapers from driveways, the faint clink of dishes in kitchen sinks. But at Maple and Steam Cafe, a small corner shop bustling with regulars, something was off. Lila Dawson's name wasn't on the schedule, but everyone expected her to show up just the same. She never missed a shift, not even when she was sick or overwhelmed by schoolwork. When the clock reached 9 and Lila still hadn't arrived, the manager assumed she must be running late. By 10, an uneasy feeling crept in. A coworker sent her a text, got no reply. The hours dragged, tension building behind the counter. Somewhere in that windowless back office, the weight of her absence became something heavy and real. Meanwhile, Evan McKinley tried to distract himself with chores at home, telling himself Lila was just tired, maybe sleeping in after her late night. But by late morning, concern overpowered logic. He drove to Pleasant Run Road, his mind racing with possibilities. A flat tire, a forgotten alarm, a migraine. He parked behind her car in the driveway, feeling the first prickles of dread. The car hadn't moved since last night. He knocked. No answer. He tried the handle, surprised when the door swung open at his touch. A draft drifted out, tinged with the stale scent of mint and paint. The apartment was still and dim, sunlight leaking in around the edges of the curtains. The kitchen counter looked exactly as he remembered. Lila's purse, phone, and keys stacked in a tidy row. Her favorite mug, half full of cold tea, sat beside a plate with a smudge of pie crust. On the table, a canvas waited, brushstrokes interrupted in mid-motion. There was a blanket on the chair, still holding the faint warmth of someone's recent presence, but there was no sign of Lila. The details, so ordinary at first, now felt wrong. The door was unlocked, something Lila never forgot to check. Her phone, always within arm's reach, sat untouched. Her keys, the same ones she spun on her finger when nervous, lay motionless. The whole place hummed with a strange, suspended energy, as if time had briefly stopped. Evan called her name, a note of panic seeping into his voice. The apartment remained silent, save for the gentle rattle of the balcony door, left slightly ajar, a thin curtain fluttering in the breeze. Outside, the world continued its quiet rhythm. unaware of the chasm opening in this small, cluttered room. With his heart pounding, Evan dialed 911, words tumbling out as he tried to explain what he couldn't quite believe. She wouldn't just leave. I know she wouldn't. His certainty was punctuated by the ordinariness of the scene. Everything in its place except for the most important thing. Police arrived swiftly, their presence turning the gentle disorder of Lila's apartment into a crime scene. They moved with deliberate care, noting the lack of forced entry, the untouched valuables, the immaculate kitchen. No footprints, no signs of a struggle, nothing obviously out of place except the absence that screamed from every corner. The officers combed through her belongings, scrolling through her phone, marking the time of her last sent message. 12:17 a.m., 2 minutes before the device went dead. As officers spoke in hushed tones, neighbors gathered in the parking lot, faces etched with disbelief. A few tried to remember if they'd seen anything strange. Most could only shake their heads. "Nothing ever happens here," they whispered, watching as police tape flickered in the sunlight. All that remained were questions, stretching in every direction, swallowing up the simple comfort of routine. By dusk, the news would ripple through Fairfield, unsettling the town's peace. But for now, inside that apartment on Pleasant Run Road, only the silence spoke, and it was deafening. The disappearance of Lila Dawson hit Fairfield like a sudden storm, rattling the fragile calm that the town had always taken for granted. By Sunday afternoon, the news had traveled faster than the police tape could be stretched across her apartment door. At the corner store, customers whispered in tight circles. At church, prayers were hastily added for a safe return. The sense of security that had long defined this community was suddenly, unmistakably broken. By Monday morning, missing person posters were taped to telephone poles and bus stop benches, Lila's gentle smile staring out at neighbors who had never imagined needing to memorize the details of her face. Friends and classmates formed search parties, fanning out through city parks, hiking wooded trails, and combing empty lots behind the cafe. The air hummed with nervous energy as the rhythm of daily life gave way to anxious speculation. Lila's father, Dave Dawson, moved through these days in a kind of stunned trance. Each morning he drove to her apartment, parked beside her untouched car, and sat for long minutes staring up at the balcony where he'd last seen her wave goodbye. He barely slept, barely ate. Instead, he poured his aching worry into action, printing flyers, knocking on doors, sharing Lila's story with anyone who would listen. He even planted a sign in his own front yard. "Please help me bring my daughter home." The words painted in trembling, uneven strokes. Every gesture, no matter how small, was a way to stave off the terror of helplessness. As dusk fell each night, neighbors gathered in front of Lila's building, holding flickering candles that turned the sidewalk gold and filled the air with soft prayers. The crowds grew larger with each passing evening, silent except for the occasional sniffle or whispered hope. The flame of each candle seemed to carry the town's longing, pooling into a gentle glow that lingered after midnight. Fairfield's local news stations ran updates every hour, interviews with friends, old photos from high school, any new scrap of information that police released. Each broadcast reached more than just the worried residents. It reverberated through the town's collective consciousness. With every unanswered question, fear crept further in. People began to lock their doors at night, something many had never bothered to do. Some neighbors left porch lights burning until dawn, Children were walked to school in groups, the routine so familiar, now shadowed by anxiety. Through it all, the small details began to take on outsized importance. One elderly neighbor swore she'd seen Lila's apartment light shining long after midnight. A teenager reported hearing a door creak open, though she couldn't say for certain which apartment it came from. Each fragment of memory was picked apart and replayed, fed into the rumor mill that churned day and night. But nothing concrete emerged. No sightings, no suspects, just a growing sense that Fairfield had lost something far more precious than its quiet. Lila's absence was like a missing note in a favorite song, a silence that threw every familiar routine out of tune. The cafe where she worked felt emptier, the neighborhood walks less cheerful. Her friends clung to each other, organizing new searches, holding on to hope even as it slipped, bit by bit, through their fingers. For Dave, every sunset brought a new ache. The sight of Lila's empty room, her unfinished paintings, the old watch ticking on her nightstand, it was all unbearable, but he refused to let despair win. He carried her photograph into the woods, calling her name, determined that his daughter's story would not fade into another cold case. "I'll keep looking until I find her," he promised, his voice low, the grief in his chest shared by everyone who knew and loved the missing girl. In Fairfield, fear and hope were now tangled together, each day darker and more uncertain than the last. The whole town waited, breath held, praying for the light to return. As days bled into weeks, Fairfield seemed suspended in a fog of questions. The search parties thinned but never stopped. Dave Dawson's sign stayed in his front yard, weathered now, as steadfast as the man himself. Behind the scenes, police in the small department launched an official effort they called Operation Sketchlight. They pieced together every shred of Lila's last hours, from text records to neighbors' recollections, determined to force meaning from the silence. Detectives focused first on the circle closest to Lila. At the center stood Evan McKinley, the fiancé who had discovered her empty apartment. He cooperated, his voice soft in interviews, hands clasped tightly in his lap, grief written in the droop of his shoulders. He repeated the details again and again, the late-night messages, the unlocked door, the cup of tea gone cold. But the investigators, seasoned by years of routine but now facing something darker, pressed harder. Every story has two sides, and every love has its shadows. Word spread that Evan and Lila had argued about her upcoming move. Nothing dramatic, but enough to raise eyebrows in a town unaccustomed to secrets. One of Lila's closest friends came forward quietly, sharing that Lila had confided worries about Evan's recent mood swings, his anxiety about leaving Ohio behind. "He's been different, angrier," the friend had whispered, and that was enough for suspicion to take root in the community. The timeline became the backbone of the investigation. Police pored over phone records. Lila's last outgoing message, "I think everything's going to be okay," sent at 12:17 a.m., her phone going silent minutes later. Evan's own phone powered down at 12:19 a.m. Was it coincidence or choreography? Detectives traced his movements, checked alibis, questioned coworkers at the print shop. They searched his car, his apartment, every corner of his memory. Nothing conclusive emerged. No fingerprints, no evidence of violence, no reason for the unlocked door or the open balcony in the stillness of the night. But Fairfield was already beginning to look at Evan through new eyes. When he appeared on television, pleading for Lila's safe return, Some saw genuine heartbreak, while others noted how carefully the tears fell, how his words seemed practiced, almost too controlled. His pain, played on a loop by the evening news, became an object of public scrutiny. Rumors swelled. Some thought they heard anger behind his grief. Others believed he was simply a young man outmatched by tragedy. Detectives broadened their search. They retraced Lila's last days, talked to her art professors, sifted through her online messages, called everyone who might have seen her that weekend. They found nothing out of place, no enemies, no unexplained calls or visitors. Her life, so full of color and detail, suddenly seemed to stop, mid-stroke, like the unfinished painting left on her kitchen table. In the absence of hard evidence, fear and speculation filled the vacuum. Evan was never charged. There simply wasn't enough. But the undercurrent of suspicion persisted, rippling through the town, whispered at backyard barbecues and over coffee at Maple and Steam. Some clung to hope, others to their own theories, everyone desperate for closure. As summer faded to autumn, Fairfield learned to live with uncertainty. Missing posters became part of the landscape, fading in the sun. Lila's father kept searching. Evan kept his distance, eyes downcast at the grocery store, a silent figure shadowed by doubt. And all the while, the question lingered. Was the person responsible for Lila's disappearance one of their own, hiding in plain sight? In this town where trust had once been absolute, now nothing and no one seemed safe. As the seasons shifted and the trees lining Fairfield streets exchanged green for brittle gold, hope for Lila's safe return faded into a haunting ache. Posters curled and yellowed on telephone poles, the corners lifting in the wind. At first, every new week brought a surge of tips and fresh faces to the search parties. But over time, the volunteers dwindled. The search became a ritual for only the most determined, and none more so than Dave Dawson. Dave refused to surrender to the town's quiet resignation. Every Sunday, as he had before, he drove the familiar route to Lila's old apartment, parked beside her unused car, and gazed at her window. Then he would drive out past the city limits, into the woods and back roads, carrying nothing but a flashlight, a battered photograph of Lila, and stubborn, unyielding love. He stopped at abandoned barns, trailed creek beds, scoured ditches for any trace, any sign, any answer. His determination became legendary, a fixture in the local news. But what the cameras never caught was the loneliness, the empty house he returned to each night. The community, too, struggled beneath the weight of the unknown. People avoided discussing the case, as if speaking Lila's name would summon more heartbreak. The cafe where she had worked felt changed, a little quieter, laughter softer, shadows longer. Friends stopped coming in as often, unable to bear the sight of her favorite table, the smudges of paint on the counter that no one bothered to clean away. Even the neighbors who once gathered nightly with candles now kept their curtains closed. Fairfield's police, faced with a case that refused to yield, slowly exhausted their resources. Leads dried up. The carefully organized investigation boards came down. Detectives were reassigned to fresh crimes, and Lila's file joined the other unsolved cases in a gray metal cabinet. The town moved on, at least on the surface, but the absence remained like an ache in the bones. Then, in the spring of 2013, nearly 2 years after that terrible night, a call came from Indiana, a state line and 30 miles away from Pleasant Run Road. A man scavenging for scrap metal in the thickets outside Cedar Grove stumbled on a large black trash bag, hidden in the underbrush. Inside, he found what was left of a young woman, bones wrapped in faded plastic, the remnants of a life lost too soon. DNA tests confirmed what Dave had never stopped fearing and never stopped searching for. It was Lila. The medical examiner delivered the facts with clinical detachment, but the words landed like a blow. The remains showed signs of violence, sharp wounds to the left wrist, the skull carefully wrapped, the body concealed for more than 18 months. There was no gentle way to receive such news. The hope that had burned for so long was finally, cruelly, extinguished. Fairfield was paralyzed by the revelation. For days, the entire town seemed to move in slow motion, grief and horror mixing with shame for every moment anyone had dared to move on. The cafes were silent. Neighbors nodded solemnly in the street, unsure what to say to Dave or to each other. The missing girl was missing no more, but the answers everyone craved remained out of reach. Why? Who? How could something so violent have happened in a world so ordinary? Dave, with a strength that left others speechless, buried his daughter, then returned to the only task he had left, seeking justice, refusing to let Lila become just another cold case. The rest of Fairfield watched, haunted by the knowledge that a murderer still walked among them, and that the darkest secrets can hide in the most familiar places. Years drifted past, leaving behind a ghostly quiet where grief had once thundered. Lila's name faded from the headlines, and the candlelight vigils stopped. But for those who had loved her, the ache only sharpened with each year of unanswered questions. In Fairfield, life pressed on. The high school welcomed new students, the old cafe changed owners, and fresh paint covered the last of the missing posters. But in small, unseen ways, the shadow of Lila Dawson's disappearance never truly left. Then, almost 12 years after that silent August night, a shift came when no one expected it. In 2023, a young detective in the Butler County Cold Case Unit began re-examining old files, reading transcripts, sorting evidence, and scrutinizing timelines that had long since been set aside. To the detective, something in the case had always felt unfinished, the absence of answers almost as tangible as the missing girl herself. One day, in a stack of yellowed interview notes, a single sentence leapt out. A former friend of Evan McKinley had never been formally questioned, despite living nearby on the night Lila vanished. Tracked down after more than a decade, the old friend, pale, anxious, and carrying his own years of regret, finally told a story he had buried. On that humid night, hours after the world thought Lila had simply disappeared, Evan had appeared at his door, tense and breathless, holding a black trash bag. "I need you to get rid of this," Evan had insisted, saying it was just old clothes. The friend, afraid and confused, followed instructions, burned the bag in a backyard barrel, watched the flames devour its contents, and spent years convincing himself it meant nothing. This single revelation cracked the silence that had sealed the case. The cold case detective secured a warrant to search Evan's mother's house, where Evan had briefly stayed after Lila vanished. Hidden deep in a bedroom drawer, they found a weathered, handwritten page, half poem, half confession. "I love her. You want to kill her, but I can't stop myself." Forensic teams took the evidence, turning over every scrap of cloth and ash from the property where the trash bag had been burned so many years ago. By some miracle, beneath layers of debris, they uncovered a piece of scorched fabric clinging to a strand of Lila's hair. The DNA match was irrefutable. When the news broke, Fairfield staggered under the weight of betrayal. The grieving fiancé, who had wept on television, joined search parties, and stood at Dave Dawson's side, was suddenly recast as a monster hiding in plain sight. Old footage played on every screen, Evan's tearful pleas now scrutinized for signs of deception, his quiet grief reinterpreted as guilt. Friends recoiled, neighbors whispered, and the cafe where he and Lila had once sat side by side felt forever changed. On March 24, 2023, police arrived at Evan's door. This time, his hands shook for reasons he could not hide. He did not protest, did not beg or threaten. He was arrested for first-degree murder, led away in handcuffs beneath a gray, indifferent sky. For Dave Dawson, there was no satisfaction in the sound of the jail cell slamming shut, no closure in the headlines or the reporters crowding his porch. What lingered was a bitter aftertaste, a realization that justice, however late, was always tangled with loss. Fairfield learned the hardest truth of all, that evil does not always arrive with thunder and warning, but sometimes slips quietly through unlocked doors, wearing the face of someone you once trusted. The community, once united in hope, now shared a darker bond, a reminder that the answers you seek might be closer and more painful than you ever dared imagine. Spring in Ohio brought rain and lilacs, their sweetness drifting through the courthouse windows as the trial began. The world outside had turned green again, but inside, everything was gray. The faces, the walls, the truth that finally pressed forward after 13 years of waiting. The courtroom filled with reporters, townspeople, and strangers drawn by the headlines. At the center sat Dave Dawson, his back straighter than it had been in years, his fingers curled around a photograph of his daughter that never left his pocket. Evan McKinley, now older, thinner, and haunted, kept his eyes down. For so long he had been part of Fairfield's collective sympathy, a character in the town's story of loss. Now he was the villain, a man who had loved and destroyed in the same breath. Prosecutors moved with care, piecing together a story that felt both impossibly distant and terrifyingly close. There were the old texts, the timeline of silence, the hurried visit to a friend's house with a trash bag, the scrawled poem, the strand of hair that had refused to burn. The evidence was laid out like a dark tapestry, each thread tying Evan more tightly to the girl he had once promised a future. Dave's turn to speak came after days of testimony. The room stilled as he rose, eyes on the young man he had once trusted like a son. "I kept her room the same for 13 years, Dave said, his voice rough with old pain. "I just want to know why." His words hung in the air, heavy with everything that had gone unspoken for over a decade. Evan could only stare at the table, voice small, almost childlike. "We argued. She said she was leaving. I lost control. I didn't mean to." The confession, when it came, was stripped of drama, just a bare, broken truth. He told the court about his panic, the blinding moment of rage, the desperate, shameful attempts to hide what he'd done. His words filled the room with a different kind of silence, not the emptiness of mystery, but the harsh stillness of grief finally named. Prosecutors called it a crime of passion, a love that curdled into violence and panic. He loved her and killed her in the same breath, they told the jury, echoing the poem found in Evan's drawer. The defense argued for mercy, speaking of regret, mental strain, the long years spent under suspicion. In the end, perhaps out of exhaustion, perhaps because the past could never be mended, a deal was made. Evan pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter and received just 3 years in prison. To the people of Fairfield, it felt like a second injustice, the weight of so many years exchanged for a sentence measured in months. But for Dave Dawson, and for those who had loved Lila, justice was never going to mean restoration. It was about the story finally being told, about the truth finding light, even after so much darkness. Later, as he packed up Lila's sketchbooks, her life captured in wild, hopeful color, Dave found a letter she had never mailed. Written in looping script, it read, "If love makes you afraid, it's not love anymore." He folded it carefully, feeling both the loss and the strange relief that her words, at last, had been heard. The trial was over. Evan was led away. The reporters left. The crowd dispersed, and Fairfield slowly exhaled, the tension of years unraveling into sadness. But in the quiet aftermath, a new promise took root: to remember Lila, to refuse silence, and to never let fear replace love. When the verdict was read and the courtroom emptied, the story of Lila Dawson faded from the glare of breaking news into the softer, lingering light of memory. For Fairfield, the case was more than a headline. It was a wound that ran through families, friendships, and the very way neighbors looked at each other. Yet even as the world moved on, Lila's name remained in the quiet moments of the town's routine, the pauses in conversation, the lingering glances at her favorite seat in the cafe. But the tragedy of Lila Dawson was not unique. It echoed, almost unbearably, the real-life disappearance of Caitlin Markham from Fairfield, Ohio, in 2011. Caitlin, like Lila, was a young woman with a bright future, creative ambitions, and a loving circle of friends and family. She vanished into the night, her absence leaving behind confusion, desperation, and years of unanswered questions. For 2 years, her father and the people who loved her searched, hoped, and mourned, holding on to the same slim thread of possibility that one day she would come home. Her remains, too, were found by chance, 30 miles away in Cedar Grove, Indiana. There, the answers were as chilling as the silence had been. Evidence of violence, a body hidden and left to weather the passage of time. The case, like Lila's, grew cold. Suspicions mounted, but evidence refused to emerge. Ohioans followed every twist and false lead, every news update and renewed plea for help, as Caitlin's family clung to hope even as the seasons changed and memories faded from the public's attention. Years later, it was only through the tenacity of a cold case detective and the courage of a conscience finally awakened that the truth began to surface. In 2023, Caitlin's fiancé, John Carter, was charged with her murder. The shockwave ran through Fairfield and beyond. The person most trusted, the one who had stood by the family's side, was suddenly cast as the suspect, and later the confessed killer. The parallels to Lila's story were impossible to ignore. The intimacy of violence, the devastation of betrayal, the long shadow cast by silence. Caitlin's case became a touchstone in Ohio, a story that haunted conversations about safety, love, and the vulnerability of trusting the people closest to us. Her photo lingered in police stations and community boards, a reminder that behind every headline there was a real family, real friends, and a real world upended. News specials revisited the investigation, podcasts debated the details, and families who had lost their own daughters reached out to Caitlin's father in solidarity. Her story became a rallying cry for justice, not just for her, but for all those lost voices whose cases remained unsolved. In Fairfield, the impact lingered long after the legal case closed. Parents watched their children more closely. Friendships bore new layers of caution, and the community's sense of invulnerability was forever shaken. But even as fear took root, so did a different kind of resolve, a determination to honor those who had been lost by never forgetting, by telling their stories, and by supporting families who found themselves suddenly living inside a nightmare. For the Dawsons and the Markhams alike, the end of the case was not the end of grief. Healing came slowly, in small gestures, in the lighting of a candle, in the quiet preservation of a bedroom, in the refusal to let memories be erased by the passage of time. Their daughters, gone but not forgotten, became part of the fabric of the town's history, a reminder that even the smallest places can hold the largest sorrows, and that hope, though fragile, can persist against all odds. In the years that followed, Fairfield quietly resumed its old rhythms. The seasons circled back, spring's new grass, summer's fireworks, autumn leaves drifting over the familiar sidewalks. But something essential had changed in the heart of the town. For those who had lived through Lila Dawson's disappearance and the years of waiting and wondering, life would never return to what it once was. The pain of loss faded, but it never vanished. It lived in the spaces between ordinary moments, in the hollow left by a voice missing at Sunday dinner, in the empty chair beside the window. Yet the story of Lila Dawson, like that of Caitlin Markham, whose real tragedy inspired so much of Fairfield's reckoning, became more than a cautionary tale. It was a testament to the power of persistence, the fierceness of family, and the courage required to keep searching for the truth even when the world is urging you to move on. Dave Dawson, who had walked those woods and fields so many times that his footprints became as much a part of the landscape as the roots beneath the soil, carried his daughter's memory into every day. His refusal to surrender became a quiet rallying cry. Never give up. Never let silence become the final answer. For the community, the lesson was a difficult one. Fairfield learned that even the safest neighborhoods, the closest families, and the happiest relationships could harbor darkness no one imagined. The people grew more watchful, not just of strangers, but of one another, attentive to changes in mood, to unspoken fears, to those subtle signals that something might be wrong. Teachers, friends, and parents began to speak more openly about warning signs, about the importance of listening and believing when someone said they felt unsafe. They learned to trust their instincts and, above all, to reach out when love became tangled with fear. If Lila's story taught anything, it was that silence is the enemy of safety. For every case like hers, there are countless others where fear or shame keeps victims from seeking help, where warning signs are missed or ignored. In the aftermath, Fairfield launched new community initiatives, self-defense classes at the high school, support groups at the local church, annual walks to raise awareness about domestic violence and missing persons. The town rallied, not just to remember what had been lost, but to try, however imperfectly, to protect those still vulnerable. Dave Dawson sometimes spoke at these gatherings. He rarely offered grand speeches, but his words carried the weight of lived experience. If you ever find yourself in a relationship where fear replaces love, he would say, please, leave, speak up, reach out. No one should ever feel trapped or afraid. There is help and there is hope, even when you can't see it. His message lingered in the minds of listeners long after the events ended. At the end of each gathering, candles were lit in memory of Lila and Caitlin, and for all the others whose stories remained unfinished. The flames flickered together, sending warm light into the dark, a small rebellion against forgetting. And as neighbors stood side by side, a new sense of unity emerged, not built on naive trust, but on the hard-earned understanding that justice and safety require vigilance and compassion from everyone. So as Fairfield moved forward, it did so with eyes open and hearts aware. The stories of Lila and Caitlin continued to ripple outward, reminders to speak, to act, and to care. Because some wounds can only be healed by truth, and some memories must never be allowed to fade. In remembering, in telling, and in demanding justice, the town kept hope alive and made sure the light in Lila Dawson's window was never truly extinguished.